The ballroom fell silent the moment Brian Carter slipped his arm around another woman and introduced her as the future of his life, while his wife, Kimberly King, stood only a few feet away. Laughter rippled through the crowd as he dismissed Kimberly as someone who had never contributed a dollar to his success. She neither defended herself nor walked away. She simply watched. What Brian could not possibly know was that the largest unpaid loan keeping his company alive belonged to a lender whose name had never appeared on his paperwork. In only a few hours, the truth would arrive with bank records, legal documents, and consequences no apology could erase. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If you believe that patience, truth, and justice always matter more than pride, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next story. For nearly a decade, most people who knew Brian Carter and Kimberly King believed they were looking at a marriage built on trust, sacrifice, and shared ambition. They lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside Boston, where maple trees lined the streets and neighbors greeted one another by name. Their home was comfortable rather than extravagant. A two-story colonial with a small porch, white shutters, and a backyard that Kimberly carefully maintained every spring. From the outside, theirs appeared to be the kind of life many couples quietly hoped to build. Appearances, however, had always favored Brian. He enjoyed being the center of every conversation, at business gatherings, charity dinners, and neighborhood barbecues. Brian had an effortless smile and an endless supply of stories about contracts won, warehouses opened, and new opportunities waiting just around the corner. He possessed the rare confidence that could inspire investors, attract employees, and persuade strangers that success was inevitable. Kimberly rarely interrupted those stories. She usually stood nearby with a calm expression, listening more than speaking, offering polite smiles whenever someone congratulated her husband. Many assumed she simply lacked interest in business. Others imagined she preferred a quiet domestic life, while Brian carried the financial burden for the family. Neither assumption was true. Long before Brian had dreamed of owning Carter Freight Solutions, Kimberly King had built a reputation inside one of Boston's most respected commercial lending firms. She had never been the loudest analyst in the room. She did not dominate meetings or compete for attention. Instead, she became known for something far more valuable. She noticed details other people ignored. She could examine a company's financial statements and identify hidden risks within minutes. She recognized patterns behind missed payments, inflated projections, and overly optimistic forecasts. Senior executives often trusted her recommendations before approving multi-million-dollar lending decisions because Kimberly had developed an unusual habit. She documented everything, every conversation, every revision, every email, every signature. Her colleagues jokingly called her memory better than the company's servers. Kimberly never laughed at the joke. She simply continued keeping careful records. When she married Brian, she quietly stepped away from her corporate career. Brian insisted it would only be temporary. "My company is finally taking off," he had told her during one quiet evening in their first apartment. "Once things stabilize, we'll have plenty of time to chase both our careers." Kimberly had believed him, not because she was naive, because she trusted the man she loved. In those early years, Brian worked relentlessly. He drove trucks himself whenever deliveries fell behind schedule. He spent weekends meeting clients and weekdays negotiating warehouse leases. Kimberly admired his determination. She understood how difficult entrepreneurship could be because she had evaluated hundreds of business owners throughout her career. Whenever Brian returned home exhausted, she prepared dinner without complaint. When invoices piled up across the dining table, she organized them into folders before he even asked. When cash flow became tight during the company's second year, she quietly adjusted their household budget so Brian would never feel additional pressure. He thanked her often in those days, at least in the beginning. Success, however, changes some people slowly enough that neither they nor those closest to them notice the transformation until it has already settled into their character. As Carter Freight Solutions expanded beyond Massachusetts into neighboring states, Brian's confidence grew faster than the company itself. Employees admired him. Clients praised him. Industry magazines began publishing short articles describing him as one of New England's promising entrepreneurs. Each compliment seemed harmless on its own. Together they became something heavier. Brian gradually stopped saying "we" when discussing the business. Instead, every achievement became "my company," "my strategy," "my investment," "my vision." Kimberly noticed the change long before anyone else. She never corrected him, not because she agreed, because arguments rarely changed beliefs already reinforced by applause. The silence between them did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated through dozens of ordinary moments that appeared insignificant at the time. One evening, Brian hosted several potential investors for dinner. Kimberly spent the entire afternoon preparing the house. She arranged flowers in the dining room, cooked every dish herself, polished wine glasses, and organized financial reports Brian intended to reference during the meeting. When the guests arrived, they complimented the meal repeatedly. "This is incredible," one investor said while sampling the roasted salmon. "Your wife must be an excellent cook." Brian laughed. "She has plenty of free time." The comment lasted only a few seconds. Everyone smiled politely. Kimberly smiled too. But somewhere inside, Brian's appreciation had quietly been replaced by assumption. Later that night, while Brian celebrated what he believed would become a profitable partnership, Kimberly washed dishes alone in the kitchen. She remembered every word. Not because it had been cruel, because it had been revealing. Over the following months, similar moments became increasingly common. Whenever friends praised Brian's success, he accepted the compliments without mentioning Kimberly's countless sacrifices. Whenever relatives asked whether Kimberly planned to return to finance, Brian answered before she could speak. "She doesn't need to work." The statement sounded generous. It was not. It quietly erased everything Kimberly had once been. She never argued in front of family. Instead, she kept reading financial journals during quiet evenings after Brian fell asleep. She renewed professional certifications online. She maintained relationships with former colleagues through occasional emails. She studied changes in commercial lending regulations, bankruptcy law, and secured financing practices. Brian never asked why. He assumed old habits simply died hard. What he failed to understand was that Kimberly never abandoned the profession that had shaped her. She simply practiced it differently. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, while Brian traveled to Hartford for client meetings, Kimberly received an invitation to lunch from her longtime friend, Olivia Brooks, now a respected financial advisor specializing in private investment portfolios. They met at a small cafe overlooking Boston Harbor. After exchanging stories about work, family, and mutual friends, Olivia leaned forward. "I've always wanted to ask," she said. "Do you ever miss lending?" Kimberly looked out toward the gray water before answering. "I miss solving problems." Olivia smiled knowingly. "You were the best risk analyst I ever worked with." Kimberly shook her head gently. "I just paid attention." "Exactly." There was a long silence before Olivia spoke again. "If you ever wanted to manage capital privately instead of working for someone else, there are people who would trust your judgment immediately." Kimberly did not answer right away. Instead, she stirred her coffee thoughtfully. The idea itself was not new. She had considered it more than once. She simply had never believed the timing was right. When she returned home that evening, Brian barely looked up from his laptop. I landed another regional contract, he announced proudly. That's wonderful, Kimberly replied sincerely. I'm thinking bigger now. I know. We're going national. Kimberly smiled. I hope it works. Brian interpreted her calm response as lack of excitement. In reality, she was studying something else entirely. His optimism, his spending, his increasingly aggressive expansion, and the subtle distance growing between confidence and caution. That night, after Brian had gone to bed, Kimberly sat alone in the small office overlooking the backyard. She opened a leather notebook she had kept for years. Inside were handwritten observations, financial reminders, and personal reflections. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, simply facts, dates, numbers, conversations, promises. She wrote one additional sentence before closing the notebook. Success is easiest to misunderstand when everyone applauds before asking who built the foundation. Then she placed the notebook inside a locked drawer. Outside, the rain continued falling across the quiet neighborhood. Inside the Carter home, neither husband nor wife realized how close they were to standing on opposite sides of the same financial future. Brian believed he was building an empire entirely on his own. Kimberly already saw the first invisible cracks forming beneath it. Morning arrived quietly over Boston, bringing with it the familiar rhythm that had defined Kimberly King's life for years. She woke before sunrise, brewed coffee without waking Brian, and sat by the kitchen window while the first light spread across the backyard. The stillness had become part of her routine. It was during these quiet hours, before phones began ringing and expectations filled the day, that she could think clearly. Brian often joked that Kimberly enjoyed silence too much. He never understood that silence was where she did her best work. Long before she had become Brian Carter's wife, Kimberly had built her career on listening more than speaking. In conference rooms crowded with executives eager to approve ambitious loans, she had developed a habit of allowing everyone else to reveal themselves first. Borrowers who exaggerated their confidence often exposed weaknesses they had intended to hide. Investors who talked endlessly about opportunity frequently overlooked risk. Kimberly had learned that facts rarely announced themselves. They waited patiently for someone willing to notice them. That ability had shaped every important decision of her professional life. Years earlier, after graduating near the top of her class with a degree in finance, Kimberly joined one of Boston's oldest commercial lending institutions. The position was demanding, and the expectations were relentless. New analysts often competed to impress senior management with bold recommendations and optimistic projections. Kimberly earned respect for doing the opposite. While others searched for reasons to approve a loan, she searched for reasons it might fail. At first, some executives considered her overly cautious. Then the economy shifted. Several companies that had received enthusiastic endorsements from other analysts collapsed under excessive debt. Kimberly's reports, however, had consistently identified the same warning signs. Months in advance, unstable cash flow, unrealistic expansion plans, weak internal controls, and executives whose confidence exceeded their discipline. Her reputation changed almost overnight. She became the analyst assigned to the institution's most complex files. Not because she enjoyed saying no, because when Kimberly finally said yes, everyone understood the decision rested on evidence rather than optimism. Even after leaving her corporate position following her marriage to Brian, that reputation did not disappear. Former colleagues still sought her opinion from time to time. Old clients occasionally asked whether she would review investment opportunities privately. For several years, Kimberly politely declined every request. She had chosen a different life, or at least she believed she had. The turning point came gradually rather than dramatically. It began with an unexpected phone call from an elderly client named Richard Lawson, the founder of a family-owned manufacturing company Kimberly had once helped refinance during difficult economic conditions. Richard had never forgotten her honesty. "I know you don't work at the bank anymore," he said over the phone one afternoon, "but I trust your judgment more than anyone else's." Kimberly thanked him, but reminded him she no longer provided lending advice professionally. "I'm not asking for advice," Richard replied gently. "I'm asking whether you've ever considered managing investments yourself." The question lingered in her mind long after the conversation ended. A week later, she met Richard and his attorney for lunch. Instead of discussing his company, Richard spoke about retirement. "I've spent 40 years building something," he said. "Now every investment manager I meet seems more interested in commissions than responsibility." He looked directly at Kimberly. "You've always treated money as someone else's future, not your own opportunity." Those words stayed with her. Over the following months, similar conversations occurred with several former clients. Successful business owners, retired physicians, family trusts, people who valued caution over excitement. They all described the same problem. Too many investment firms focused on growth at any cost. Very few prioritized disciplined lending backed by strong legal protection. Kimberly recognized the opportunity immediately. She also recognized the responsibility. Rather than returning to a traditional financial institution, she spent nearly a year researching private credit funds, secured lending regulations and investment structures permitted under federal and Massachusetts law. Every evening after Brian fell asleep, she studied updated statutes, attended virtual legal seminars, and reviewed hundreds of pages of regulatory guidance. She took notes exactly as she always had. Meticulous, organized, complete. When questions became too technical, she consulted one person she trusted completely: Michael Bennett. Michael had practiced commercial law for more than 25 years and had represented banks' investment partnerships and private lenders throughout New England. Unlike many attorneys, he preferred clear language over theatrical arguments. When Kimberly first explained her idea, Michael listened without interrupting. Only after she finished did he ask a single question. "Do you intend to lend money?" he said. "Or do you intend to build a system that survives even when borrowers fail?" Kimberly answered without hesitation. "The system." Michael smiled. "Then we can build something that lasts." Over the next several months, they established an independent private lending company, structured through carefully drafted legal entities. Ownership records remained confidential within the limits allowed by law. Investment capital came from Kimberly's personal savings inheritance from her late parents, and contributions from a small circle of accredited investors who trusted her judgment. Everything was documented. Every dollar transferred into the fund carried supporting records. Every investment agreement underwent legal review before execution. Every loan required collateral repayment schedules, default provisions, and detailed reporting obligations. Michael often joked that Kimberly prepared documentation thoroughly enough to satisfy 3 separate courts. She simply replied, "Paper remembers better than people." The fund grew slowly, intentionally. Kimberly rejected far more applications than she approved. Many entrepreneurs arrived with polished presentations and ambitious promises. She declined them politely, not because their dreams lacked value, because their numbers lacked discipline. Occasionally, applicants became frustrated. One business owner accused her of thinking like a banker instead of an investor. Kimberly answered calmly, "Responsible lending protects both sides." Years later, that same company filed for bankruptcy. Her records remained accurate. Within 5 years, Kimberly's private lending operation had quietly become one of the most respected boutique credit funds among a limited circle of investors. It never advertised. It rarely appeared in financial publications. Its success spread through reputation rather than publicity. Borrowers who honored their obligations received fair treatment. Borrowers who ignored contractual responsibilities discovered that every agreement had been drafted with extraordinary precision. Meanwhile, at home, Brian remained almost completely unaware of what Kimberly had built. He knew she handled investments. He assumed that they were modest retirement accounts and conservative stock portfolios. Occasionally, he noticed her reviewing spreadsheets or participating in video conferences from the home office. He rarely asked questions. Business conversations interested him only when they involved his own company. One evening, while Brian prepared for an industry conference in Chicago, he walked past Kimberly's office and noticed stacks of organized folders across her desk. "What are all those?" he asked casually. "Quarterly reviews," Kimberly replied. "For your investments." "Something like that." Brian nodded absent-mindedly. "As long as somebody around here enjoys paperwork." He laughed at his own joke before returning upstairs. Kimberly watched him leave. She did not feel offended, only thoughtful. He had once admired her attention to detail. Now he barely noticed it. A few days later, Olivia Brooks visited Kimberly's office to review portfolio performance. Spread across the conference table were reports detailing dozens of secured commercial loans across several states. Default rates remained remarkably low. Returns exceeded expectations without requiring excessive risk. Olivia closed one folder and looked across the table. "You know," she said, "if people knew who was actually making these lending decisions, your reputation would be enormous." Kimberly smiled faintly. "My reputation isn't the goal." "What is?" "Helping businesses that deserve the chance. And the ones that don't." Kimberly glanced toward the neatly arranged contracts. "They decide that themselves." Olivia understood exactly what she meant. No borrower was ever forced to sign an agreement. Every obligation existed because someone had accepted it voluntarily. That principle mattered deeply to Kimberly. Responsibility began with informed choices. Late that evening, after Olivia had gone, Kimberly completed one final review before shutting down her computer. A new financing request had arrived from a regional logistics company seeking substantial expansion capital. She noticed the industry immediately. Transportation, freight, warehousing. The proposal itself was incomplete, containing preliminary financial statements, but not yet identifying the borrower by name. She marked several sections requiring additional documentation and closed the file. It would return once underwriting gathered the remaining information. For Kimberly, it was simply another application awaiting careful evaluation. She had no reason to suspect that within weeks, the company requesting millions of dollars in financing would carry a name she knew better than anyone else. Nor could Brian imagine that the future of Carter Freight Solutions was quietly making its way toward the desk of the one person he believed had already left the world of finance behind. Neither of them recognized the invisible intersection approaching between marriage and money. But the paperwork had already begun its journey. And paperwork, unlike memory, never forgot. The proposal arrived on Kimberly King's desk 3 weeks later, neatly organized inside a secure digital folder marked for secondary review. By then, autumn had settled over Boston. The maple trees lining the neighborhood streets had turned brilliant shades of crimson and gold, while cold winds reminded everyone that another New England winter was approaching. Kimberly opened the file without expecting anything unusual. Every week, dozens of commercial lending requests passed through her private fund. Most would never receive approval. Some lacked sufficient collateral. Others depended on unrealistic revenue projections. A few belonged to entrepreneurs who believed confidence could replace financial discipline. She treated every application exactly the same. Names never impressed her. Numbers did. The file contained preliminary financial statements, projected expansion costs, warehouse acquisition plans, and transportation contracts stretching across several northeastern states. The business itself appeared promising. Revenue had grown steadily for 4 consecutive years. Customer retention remained above industry averages. Operating margins were healthy enough to justify moderate expansion. Kimberly highlighted several strengths before continuing deeper into the documentation. Then she reached the ownership page. Her eyes paused. Carter Freight Solutions, Chief Executive Officer, Brian Carter. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Not because Kimberly felt shocked, because she understood immediately how carefully she would need to proceed. She leaned back in her chair and slowly closed the document. Professional responsibility demanded impartiality. Marriage complicated everything. Before reviewing another page, Kimberly picked up her phone and called Michael Bennett. "I need your advice," she said calmly. Within an hour, Michael arrived carrying his leather briefcase. He listened without interruption as Kimberly explained the situation. When she finished, he folded his hands thoughtfully. "Do you intend to participate in the decision?" Kimberly looked toward the window. "I don't know." Michael nodded. "Legally, you have several options." He outlined them one by one. Kimberly could recuse herself completely and allow outside analysts to review the file. She could disclose the relationship to every investor connected to the fund and obtain written consent before participating. Or she could establish an independent review committee, while remaining informed only about the final recommendation. Each option satisfied legal requirements. None answered the personal question. Michael finally asked what truly mattered. "What do you believe Brian would do if he knew the application had reached your desk?" Kimberly answered honestly. "He would refuse to let me be involved. Because he wouldn't want people thinking he needed my help." Michael sighed quietly. "Then perhaps the real issue isn't conflict of interest. It's pride." Kimberly didn't respond, because she knew he was right. Later that afternoon, Olivia Brooks joined the meeting through a secure video conference. Unlike Michael, Olivia focused entirely on financial risk. "I've reviewed the preliminary numbers," she said while opening several spreadsheets. "The company has genuine potential." Kimberly nodded. "I agree. But expansion at this pace will require disciplined management. It always does." Olivia hesitated before continuing. "Can Brian handle it?" Kimberly remained silent long enough that Olivia already understood the answer wasn't simple. "He's capable," Kimberly finally said. "He also believes momentum solves every problem." Olivia closed another report. "Momentum doesn't pay debt." "No, it never has." Together, they spent nearly 3 hours examining every aspect of the proposal: projected freight demand, fuel price sensitivity, warehouse utilization, equipment depreciation, labor costs, interest coverage ratios, customer concentration. Nothing escaped review. When the meeting ended, Michael summarized the situation clearly. The company deserves financing. Kimberly looked up. "I think so too, but only under strict conditions." She agreed immediately. The following week, the application entered formal underwriting. Independent analysts, none of whom knew Kimberly's connection to Brian, conducted site inspections, interviewed management-verified customer contracts, and reviewed tax filings. Their conclusions largely matched Kimberly's own. Carter Freight Solutions possessed strong operational potential. Its greatest risk wasn't the business itself. It was its chief executive. Several analysts noted that Brian favored rapid expansion, financed primarily through debt. One report described him as highly persuasive, optimistic, and occasionally dismissive of downside scenarios. Kimberly read that sentence twice. It sounded painfully familiar. At home, Brian never mentioned the loan application. He simply appeared increasingly excited. Every evening brought new conversations about growth. We're looking at Pennsylvania next. A warehouse in New Jersey would change everything. I've been meeting investors all week. Kimberly listened while preparing dinner. Occasionally, she asked practical questions. How much additional payroll would expansion require? Brian waved the concern away. We'll figure it out. What about maintenance costs? They're manageable. Insurance. We've already accounted for it. Kimberly noticed he answered quickly, too quickly, not because he possessed certainty, because he disliked slowing down long enough to calculate uncertainty. One Saturday morning, Brian spread architectural drawings across the dining room table. He pointed enthusiastically at distribution centers, transportation routes, and projected delivery schedules. This, he said proudly, is how companies become national players. Kimberly studied the maps. They're ambitious. Brian smiled broadly. You think they're too ambitious. I didn't say that. You don't have to. She looked directly at him. I only think every expansion deserves enough capital to survive unexpected setbacks. Brian laughed. That's exactly how bankers think. Kimberly almost smiled. Sometimes bankers stay in business longer. Brian dismissed the comment with another laugh. He never realized how much truth it contained. Several days later, Michael called Kimberly with the underwriting committee's final recommendation. They approved the loan. Kimberly remained quiet. There are conditions, Michael continued. I expected that. He reviewed them carefully. The financing amount would be substantial enough to fund expansion across multiple states. Collateral would include commercial equipment, warehouse assets, and specific business accounts. Quarterly financial reporting would be mandatory. Failure to maintain required liquidity ratios would trigger corrective provisions. Repeated payment defaults would activate accelerated collection rights. Every clause reflected standard commercial lending practices. Nothing unusual, nothing unfair. Simply responsibilities accepted voluntarily. Michael paused before asking his final question. Do you want the ownership structure disclosed? Kimberly considered the question carefully. If Brian learned she controlled the lending fund, he would almost certainly reject the financing. His pride would never allow anything else. If she remained anonymous through the fund's legal structure, the company would receive the capital it genuinely needed. She wasn't trying to protect herself. She was trying to protect his opportunity. I want the process handled exactly as every other transaction. No exceptions? None. Michael nodded. Then Brian will never see your name. Only if the loan performs. Michael understood immediately, because if it didn't, certain legal disclosures would eventually become unavoidable. The contracts were finalized over the next several days. Independent trustees signed required documents. Compliance officers completed regulatory filings. Outside custodians transferred investment capital through established financial institutions. Every signature followed standard procedure. Every approval left an electronic record. Every transfer could later be verified through bank documentation. Kimberly reviewed the final agreement one last time before authorizing funding. She wasn't thinking as Brian's wife. She was thinking as a lender. Could the business succeed? Yes. Could the borrower succeed if he respected the obligations he was accepting? She signed the authorization electronically. The funds were released the following morning. Across town, Brian received confirmation that his company had secured one of the largest commercial financing packages in its history. He stared at the approval letter with disbelief before breaking into a wide smile. "We did it," he shouted inside his office. Employees applauded. Managers congratulated him. Phone calls poured in throughout the day. By evening, Brian arrived home carrying a bottle of expensive champagne. He embraced Kimberly enthusiastically. "We're finally playing in the big leagues." Kimberly smiled warmly. "I'm happy for you." Brian poured 2 glasses. "I told everyone we'd prove the banks wrong." Kimberly looked quietly at the sparkling wine. "It wasn't only banks." "What do you mean?" "Nothing." Brian lifted his glass confidently. "To the future." Kimberly gently touched her glass against his. "To responsibility," she replied. Brian barely noticed the difference. He was already celebrating a victory he believed he had earned entirely on his own. Across the city, locked inside secure servers and legal archives, every document connected to the loan rested exactly where it belonged. Waiting, patiently, for the day someone would need to read every page. The transfer cleared at exactly 9:17 on a Monday morning. Inside the accounting department of Carter Freight Solutions, notifications appeared across multiple computer screens, confirming that the expansion financing had officially arrived. The funds were distributed through the lending consortium exactly as outlined in the closing documents. To Brian Carter, it looked like another victory over skepticism. He never wondered who had insisted on every clause. He never questioned why the approval process had taken longer than expected. He certainly never imagined that the person who had spent the most time evaluating his company's future had eaten breakfast with him almost every morning for the past 9 years. Brian leaned back in his office chair and smiled at the figures displayed on his monitor. For months, expansion had been little more than an ambitious presentation shown to investors. Now it was real. Within hours, he called department heads into the conference room. Warehouse supervisors, operations managers, finance personnel, regional sales directors. Everyone crowded around the long oak table while Brian stood confidently at the front of the room. "We've secured the capital," he announced. Applause immediately filled the room. "We're opening 2 additional distribution centers before the end of the year." More applause followed. "Our competitors think we're still a regional company." He smiled. "They're about to find out they're wrong." The enthusiasm inside the room was genuine. Many employees had spent years helping Carter Freight Solutions grow from a small trucking business into a respected regional logistics company. They believed in Brian. Most of them had never seen another side of him. After the meeting, the company's chief financial officer, David Reynolds, remained behind. David had worked in corporate finance long enough to understand that securing funding was only the beginning. He closed the conference room door. "The terms are stricter than I expected." Brian shrugged. "That's what happens when you borrow serious money." David opened the financing summary. "The reporting requirements are unusually detailed. So, they'll monitor quarterly liquidity." Brian nodded impatiently. "We'll meet the numbers." They also reserved accelerated collection rights. Brian laughed. "Only if we stop paying." David looked unconvinced. "I just think we should be conservative during the first year." Brian placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're paid to worry. And you're paid to grow." David managed a small smile, though concern remained in his eyes. He had learned something over the years. Optimism generated momentum. Cash flow paid invoices. The two were not always the same. That evening, Brian returned home carrying flowers. It had become one of his favorite habits after closing major business deals. Kimberly opened the front door with her usual gentle smile. "For me?" Brian grinned. "For putting up with me." She accepted the bouquet. "I've survived worse." He laughed. "I finally got the financing." "I heard. We're expanding faster than I expected." Kimberly placed the flowers into a glass vase while listening carefully. "What happens first?" "The Pennsylvania warehouse. And after that, New Jersey." She nodded thoughtfully. "What about reserves?" Brian poured himself a glass of sparkling water. "We have enough for unexpected expenses. We're covered." Kimberly looked at him calmly. "I hope you're right." Brian smiled confidently. "I usually am." The conversation ended there. Kimberly had no intention of questioning him further. As both wife and lender, she understood something Brian did not. Advice offered to someone who believed himself invincible often sounded like criticism. Facts were more patient than arguments. Later that night, after Brian had gone upstairs, Kimberly entered her home office. Unlike the warm family spaces downstairs, the office reflected precision rather than comfort. Shelves were lined with neatly labeled binders. Digital files mirrored physical records exactly. Nothing remained undocumented. She logged into the fund's secure portal. The newly executed loan appeared among dozens of active commercial investments. Borrower Carter Freight Solutions. Status current. Risk classification moderate. Collateral verification complete. Reporting schedule quarterly. Kimberly reviewed every page once more. Not because she expected mistakes, because discipline required consistency. Michael Bennett often said that lenders failed long before borrowers did. They failed by becoming careless. Kimberly refused to become careless. A notification appeared from Michael. Closing documents archived successfully. A moment later, another message followed. Everything proceeded according to standard protocol. Kimberly typed only 3 words. "Thank you, Michael." Nothing more needed to be said. The next several months passed quickly. Construction began on the Pennsylvania Distribution Center. New trucks arrived. Additional drivers were hired. Warehouse equipment was installed. Industry publications praised Brian's rapid expansion strategy. Local business journals featured his photograph beneath headlines, describing him as one of New England's fastest-growing logistics executives. Brian framed one of the magazine covers and hung it prominently inside his office. Employees congratulated him constantly. Clients admired his confidence. Even competitors acknowledged that Carter Freight Solutions had become a serious regional force. Success surrounded Brian so completely that gratitude gradually transformed into expectation. When vendors accommodated special requests, he assumed they valued his importance. When banks approved routine credit facilities, he attributed the decisions entirely to his negotiating skills. When employees worked overtime to meet impossible deadlines, he praised their loyalty without considering the pressure he had created. Kimberly noticed every change. Not because she searched for faults, because patterns always interested her. One Friday evening, Brian hosted another dinner for investors. The guest list included transportation executives, commercial real estate developers, and financial consultants. Kimberly prepared the meal herself despite Brian suggesting they hire caterers. "I'd rather cook." "You don't have to." "I know." During dinner, the conversation revolved around expansion. One guest asked Brian what he believed separated successful entrepreneurs from unsuccessful ones. Brian answered immediately, "Confidence." Another executive smiled. "What about discipline?" Brian waved his hand dismissively. "Discipline matters, but hesitation kills more companies than debt." Several people laughed approvingly. Kimberly quietly continued serving dessert. She remembered the sentence exactly. Hesitation kills more companies than debt. Interesting. After the guests departed, Kimberly carried empty plates into the kitchen. Brian walked in moments later. That went perfectly. I'm glad. They loved the presentation. I'm sure they did. Brian leaned against the counter. You know what one investor told me? What? He said I've got instincts you can't teach. Kimberly smiled politely. Instincts are valuable. I've always trusted mine. She looked at him for a brief moment. Just remember that instincts and obligations aren't the same thing. Brian frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means contracts don't adjust themselves because someone feels confident. Brian laughed. You still think like a lender. Kimberly rinsed another plate. Someone has to. He shook his head affectionately. I love how practical you are. He kissed her forehead before leaving the kitchen. He never realized how close he had come to understanding the truth. Weeks later, the fund received its first quarterly reporting package from Carter Freight Solutions. Exactly on schedule. David Reynolds had prepared thorough financial statements. Revenue exceeded projections. Expenses remained manageable. Loan payments arrived before their due dates. Michael called Kimberly after reviewing the reports. So far, he said, Brian is performing exactly as expected. Kimberly allowed herself a quiet breath. I'm happy to hear that. You made the right decision. I hope it stays that way. Michael hesitated. Businesses don't usually fail during good quarters. No. They fail after success convinces people that rules no longer matter. Kimberly understood. She had seen it happen countless times. The first payment rarely revealed character. The 10th one usually did. For now, everything appeared stable. The company was growing. The loan remained healthy. Brian believed the future belonged entirely to him. Kimberly wanted nothing more than for that belief to become reality. She had never invested in his company hoping to prove her own importance. She had invested because she genuinely believed in what they had once dreamed of building together. But dreams, like loans, depended on something stronger than optimism. They depended on people continuing to honor the promises they had willingly made. Neither Kimberly nor Brian could yet see how quickly those promises would begin to change. Winter settled over Boston with the kind of quiet determination that slowed traffic-covered rooftops in fresh snow and turned every morning commute into a careful negotiation with the weather. Inside Carter Freight Solutions, however, the pace only accelerated. The expansion was working. New distribution routes had shortened delivery times. Regional contracts continued to arrive. Revenue climbed steadily through the first quarter. Trade publications praised Brian Carter for scaling his company, while many competitors remained cautious. Brian welcomed every compliment. He had begun traveling more frequently, attending transportation conferences, networking events, and executive retreats across the East Coast. Nearly every trip promised another opportunity to strengthen the company's reputation. It was during one of those conferences in Chicago that Brian first met Ashley Morgan. Ashley was 31 years old, intelligent, polished, and exceptionally skilled at presenting herself exactly the way ambitious executives wanted to see her. She had built a successful career in corporate marketing, helping mid-sized companies rebrand themselves for national expansion. Unlike many consultants, Ashley rarely overwhelmed clients with technical language. She spoke about vision, momentum, visibility, market dominance. Brian found the conversations refreshing. She admired confidence. He enjoyed admiration. Their first meeting lasted barely 20 minutes after a panel discussion on logistics branding. Their second lasted nearly 2 hours over coffee. By the time Brian returned to Boston, Ashley's resume was already sitting on David Reynolds's desk. "We need someone who understands national branding," Brian explained during the executive meeting. David reviewed the documents carefully. "She's expensive. So are mistakes. We already have a marketing director. Not one with her experience." David hesitated. "The current team is doing good work." Brian closed the folder. Good isn't enough anymore. Within 3 weeks, Ashley accepted the position of Vice President of Marketing. Her arrival immediately changed the atmosphere inside the executive offices. She reorganized presentation materials, redesigned investor packages, updated the company website, introduced new branding campaigns that made Carter Freight Solutions appear larger and more sophisticated than many of its competitors. Clients noticed. Industry magazines noticed. Brian noticed Ashley. She possessed an effortless ability to make people feel important. Whenever Brian proposed an ambitious idea, Ashley never questioned it immediately. Instead, she smiled. "I like how you think." Simple words, powerful effect. Brian began requesting Ashley's presence at nearly every executive meeting. When investors visited headquarters, she sat beside him. When conferences required presentations, Ashley traveled with him. When interviews were scheduled, she helped prepare his talking points. At first, no one considered it unusual. Their responsibilities naturally overlapped. Kimberly noticed Ashley's name appearing more frequently in Brian's conversations. "Ashley thinks we should sponsor the conference." Ashley suggested redesigning the fleet. "Ashley believes we're ready for another expansion." Brian rarely mentioned other executives anymore. Only Ashley. One evening, while Brian prepared for another business trip, Kimberly folded his shirts neatly into a suitcase. "How long this time?" she asked. 3 days. "Chicago again?" "No." "Philadelphia?" She nodded. "Who else is going?" "The operations team." He paused briefly. "And Ashley?" Kimberly continued folding clothes. "She travels a lot. Marketing never stops." Kimberly looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn for years. "I suppose it doesn't." Brian mistook her composure for indifference. In reality, Kimberly had simply learned that assumptions without evidence accomplished nothing. Several weeks later, Olivia Brooks invited Kimberly to lunch. They met at their usual cafe overlooking the harbor. After discussing investment performance, Olivia hesitated before changing the subject. "I wasn't sure whether to mention this." Kimberly set down her coffee. "Then mention it." Olivia chose her words carefully. "I attended the Northeast Business Leadership Summit last week." Kimberly waited. "I saw Brian there, and he and Ashley seemed—" She searched for a fair description. "Very close." Kimberly's expression remained unchanged. "In what way?" "They arrived together. They left together. They skipped several networking sessions together." Olivia looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I could be reading too much into it." Kimberly thanked her quietly. "I appreciate you telling me." Olivia studied her friend's face. "You don't seem surprised." Kimberly looked through the cafe window toward the gray winter water. "I've noticed changes." "You think something's happening?" "I think people reveal themselves gradually." She offered no further explanation. That evening, Brian returned home later than expected. Snow covered his coat. His suitcase rolled across the hardwood floor as Kimberly greeted him in the hallway. "How was Philadelphia?" "Productive." "Dinner?" "I already ate." "With clients?" Brian loosened his tie. The executive team. Kimberly simply nodded. She didn't ask another question. Later, after Brian fell asleep, she opened the shared family calendar stored on their home computer. Travel dates, flight confirmations, conference schedules. Nothing unusual appeared. Then she compared them with publicly available conference agendas. One dinner Brian claimed had lasted until 10 o'clock had actually ended before 7. Another networking event he described attending had been canceled because of severe weather. Interesting. She closed the browser. Not because she had reached a conclusion, because conclusions required more than inconsistencies. They required facts. The following month, Carter Freight Solutions hosted its annual leadership retreat at a luxury resort in Vermont. Department heads attended with spouses. Ashley arrived alone. Throughout the weekend, Kimberly observed rather than participated. During breakfast, Ashley laughed easily at Brian's stories. During presentations, Brian frequently sought Ashley's opinion before anyone else's. At dinner, they often found themselves seated beside one another. Nothing inappropriate occurred publicly. Nothing anyone could reasonably accuse them of. Yet, patterns existed. Patterns mattered. Late Saturday evening, Kimberly stepped outside onto the snow-covered terrace to enjoy a few moments of quiet. She heard footsteps behind her. Ashley. "Beautiful view," Ashley said politely. "It is." Ashley smiled. "Brian says you prefer staying out of the spotlight." Kimberly looked toward the mountains. "I don't mind letting other people talk." Ashley laughed softly. "I wish I could do that." Kimberly turned slightly. "No. You enjoy being noticed." Ashley looked surprised. "Is it that obvious?" "Only if someone pays attention." For just a second, neither woman spoke. Ashley finally broke the silence. "Brian is lucky." Kimberly answered gently, "I've always hoped so." Ashley nodded before returning inside. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Neither woman raised her voice. Neither made accusations. Yet both left understanding more than either had said aloud. Several days after the retreat, David Reynolds knocked quietly on Brian's office door. "I've been reviewing executive travel expenses." Brian barely looked up from his computer. "Everything okay?" "Mostly." David placed several reports on the desk. "Ashley's travel schedule overlaps yours almost perfectly." "So, nothing." He hesitated. "I just wanted to confirm everything was properly authorized." Brian signed the reimbursement forms without reading them carefully. "It is." David picked up the documents. "I thought so." As he walked away, uncertainty remained in his mind. He respected Brian, but years in finance had taught him another lesson. Financial irregularities rarely began with numbers. They usually began with people. Meanwhile, Kimberly continued her own quiet routines. She reviewed quarterly loan reports, maintained investment meetings, updated legal files, cooked dinner, watered the plants, smiled politely whenever Brian described Ashley's newest marketing success. She neither confronted him nor ignored what she observed. Instead, she recorded dates, travel schedules, business expenses, meeting locations. Not because she intended to build a case against her husband, because she had spent her entire professional life believing that memory could become unreliable. Documentation could not. One evening, as she closed another notebook, she paused before writing a final observation. Trust does not disappear in a single moment. It erodes through small choices repeated often enough to become habits. She closed the notebook gently. Upstairs, Brian laughed while reading a message that had just appeared on his phone. He never imagined that somewhere else in the house, The woman he believed noticed nothing had already begun assembling a timeline far more accurate than his own memory. The distance between husband and wife had not yet become visible to the world. But beneath the surface, it was widening with every quiet decision neither of them spoke aloud. And silence, Kimberly knew better than anyone, always left a record for those patient enough to keep one. Spring arrived with unexpected warmth, and for a brief time Boston seemed determined to convince everyone that difficult seasons eventually passed. Trees that had stood bare for months burst into fresh green leaves. Sidewalk cafes filled again. Delivery trucks rolled through the city beneath bright blue skies. At Carter, Freight Solutions business remained strong on paper. Revenue continued increasing. The new Pennsylvania distribution center had reached full operational capacity. The New Jersey facility was only weeks away from opening. Industry analysts praised Bryan Carter for executing one of the fastest regional expansions in the logistics sector. The numbers looked impressive. Kimberly King knew better than to trust appearances alone. Every quarter, Carter Freight Solutions submitted detailed financial reports to the lending fund exactly as required under the loan agreement. The reports arrived electronically through secure channels before being distributed to the underwriting team compliance officers and investment managers. Kimberly reviewed them only after independent analysts had completed their initial assessments. That procedure protected both the fund and herself. No special treatment, no shortcuts, exactly as she had promised. On a quiet Tuesday morning, she opened the newest quarterly report while sipping coffee in her office. Revenue had increased by nearly 18%. Operating expenses, however, had risen by almost 26%. She read the figures again, then a third time. The difference was not catastrophic, not yet. But it deserved attention. She opened the accompanying cash flow statement. Fuel costs, equipment maintenance, payroll, insurance, marketing. Her eyes stopped. Marketing expenditures had nearly tripled. Kimberly compared them with the previous quarter. Another increase. She opened the supporting schedules. National advertising campaigns, executive branding events, luxury client receptions, corporate image consultants. None of the expenses violated the loan agreement. All had received proper accounting treatment. Still, she wrote a single note in the margin of her digital review: rapid image expansion without corresponding liquidity growth. It wasn't criticism. It was observation. Later that afternoon, Michael Bennett called. "I've read the reports." "So have I." "What do you think?" Kimberly answered carefully. "The company is growing." Michael waited. "So are its commitments." "You noticed marketing?" "Yes." "And executive travel?" Kimberly nodded despite knowing he couldn't see her. "They're spending as though growth has already guaranteed future revenue." Michael closed one of the files. "Legally, everything remains compliant." "I know." "But financially," Kimberly looked at another spreadsheet, "I'd be more comfortable with stronger cash reserves." Michael understood immediately. Commercial lending rarely collapsed because companies lacked income. They failed because obligations eventually exceeded available cash. Growth concealed that reality until it no longer could. Across town, Bryan stood proudly inside the nearly completed New Jersey warehouse while Ashley Morgan photographed the facility for a promotional campaign. "This is exactly the image we need," Ashley said. She lowered the camera. "People don't buy logistics." Bryan smiled. "They buy confidence." Ashley laughed. "That's why you interview so well." Bryan looked around the enormous building. "Imagine this place operating at full capacity." "It will." "You sound certain." "I believe in you." The compliment landed exactly where Ashley intended. Brian had begun hearing those words more frequently, not only from Ashley, from magazine editors, business organizations, conference hosts, award committees. Every new recognition reinforced the belief that success had become inevitable. David Reynolds remained one of the few people willing to ask uncomfortable questions. During the monthly executive finance meeting, he distributed updated budget forecasts. "We're carrying significantly higher operating expenses." Brian skimmed the documents. "That's expected during expansion." David nodded. "Temporary expenses are expected." He pointed toward another chart. "Permanent overhead is increasing too." Ashley leaned forward. "Brand investment isn't overhead." David remained polite. "It still requires cash." Brian placed the report on the table. "We're building a national company." David answered calmly. "National companies fail too." Silence briefly settled over the room. Brian finally smiled. "You always see storms." David returned the smile. "My job is preparing for them." The meeting ended without argument. Yet no adjustments were made. Over the following weeks, Brian authorized additional spending. A redesigned corporate headquarters, luxury furniture for executive offices, premium sponsorships at transportation expos, an expensive promotional video featuring aerial drone footage of the company's facilities. Ashley approved every creative concept enthusiastically. "Our competitors look outdated." "We're changing that." Brian rarely declined her suggestions anymore. At home, Kimberly noticed subtle changes that had nothing to do with financial statements. Brian replaced his perfectly functional sedan with a luxury executive SUV. Designer suits gradually filled his closet. Fine watches appeared one after another. Each purchase could be justified individually. Together, they reflected something else, a lifestyle beginning to expand as quickly as the business. One evening, they attended a charity fundraising dinner hosted by the Boston Chamber of Commerce. Brian spent much of the evening introducing Ashley to local business leaders. Kimberly watched from nearby conversations. No inappropriate gestures, no obvious intimacy, only an unusual amount of attention. Later, while guests enjoyed dessert, an older banker approached Kimberly. "Your husband has remarkable energy." "He does. He reminds me of executives I met 30 years ago." Kimberly smiled politely. "Were they successful?" "Some." The banker paused thoughtfully. "The successful ones eventually learned the difference between growth and leverage." Before Kimberly could respond, he excused himself to greet another guest. She quietly remembered the sentence. Growth and leverage, different things. The following week, another quarterly payment arrived from Carter Freight Solutions. It was on time, exactly as required. No violation existed. The fund recorded the payment automatically. Status remained current. Michael sent Kimberly a short message. "Still performing," she replied. "Yes, for now." 3 words, nothing more. Because lenders understood something borrowers often ignored. Current payments reflected yesterday's decisions. Future defaults began with today's habits. One Friday afternoon, Olivia Brooks visited Kimberly's office carrying updated portfolio summaries. Most investments continued performing well. Only one required extended discussion: Carter Freight Solutions. Olivia spread several graphs across the conference table. "The company is profitable." Kimberly nodded. "I agree. But free cash flow is tightening." "Expansion." "Partly." Olivia hesitated. "And discretionary spending." Kimberly looked carefully at another chart. Executive entertainment expenses, travel, hospitality, marketing. The increases were gradual, not reckless. Not yet. They still have time to correct course, Olivia said. Kimberly closed the folder gently. If they recognize the need. That evening, Brian returned home unusually cheerful. He carried 2 tickets. What are those? Kimberly asked. A weekend at a luxury spa. She looked surprised. For us, Brian hesitated almost imperceptibly. No. The executive leadership team. A retreat. Something like that. Kimberly nodded. I hope it's productive. Brian looked relieved she hadn't asked additional questions. He never noticed the reservation confirmation partially visible inside the folder. Only 2 names appeared. Brian Carter, Ashley Morgan. Kimberly said nothing. After dinner, while Brian watched television upstairs, she sat quietly in her office. She opened a fresh notebook. Date, time, location, corporate retreat reservation, executive expense authorization. She attached copies of publicly available event announcements beside her handwritten notes. Nothing illegal had occurred. Nothing even confirmed inappropriate conduct. But professional discipline required chronology. Facts became meaningful only when viewed together. Before closing the notebook, Kimberly wrote one final observation. Businesses rarely fail because of one disastrous decision. They fail because small, unnecessary risks become ordinary. She placed the notebook beside earlier volumes inside the locked cabinet. Outside, warm spring rain began falling softly against the windows. Across the city, Carter Freight Solutions continued appearing stronger than ever. Investors remained optimistic. Employees remained loyal. Clients remained satisfied. Only a handful of people could see what was quietly changing beneath the surface. David saw tightening cash flow. Olivia saw increasing financial exposure. Michael saw contractual obligations growing heavier with every expansion. Kimberly saw something deeper. She saw a man gradually replacing discipline with certainty. And certainty, she had learned years ago, was often the most expensive illusion a borrower could ever afford. Summer arrived with relentless heat, and along with it came the kind of pressure that rarely appeared in quarterly reports. From the outside, Carter Freight Solutions continued to look like one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the Northeast. Industry magazines featured Brian Carter on another cover this time, beneath the headline, "The Man Redefining Regional Freight." Conference invitations multiplied. Investors requested meetings. Local business organizations asked Brian to deliver keynote speeches about leadership and entrepreneurship. Every public success made private warning signs easier to ignore. Inside the finance department, David Reynolds noticed the first serious imbalance late one Wednesday afternoon. He was reviewing the company's cash forecast for the next 60 days when a familiar number caught his attention: the next loan payment. Normally, David scheduled debt payments weeks in advance. This time, available operating cash would not comfortably cover every obligation. He recalculated, then recalculated again. The numbers remained unchanged. Revenue was healthy. Accounts receivable were growing. But too much cash was trapped in expansion projects, equipment purchases, and operating expenses. He walked directly to Brian's office. Brian was reviewing presentation slides with Ashley Morgan when David knocked. "Do you have a minute?" Brian looked up. "Of course." Ashley gathered her papers. "I'll give you two some privacy." Once she left, David closed the office door. "We've got a liquidity issue." Brian leaned back confidently. "Temporary, I believe so." "What caused it?" David placed several reports on the desk. "The New Jersey facility cost more than projected." Brian nodded. "We expected overruns." The executive branding campaign exceeded budget. Brian remained unconcerned. It'll generate future business. David pointed toward another page. The fleet replacement program accelerated ahead of schedule. Brian shrugged. Better trucks reduce maintenance. David took a slow breath. Individually, every decision made sense. And together, we're short. Brian looked at the projected figures. How short? Enough that next month's payment will be tight. Brian frowned for the first time. Can we move receivables faster? We're already trying. Delay vendors. Some. What about our credit line? David hesitated. The bank wants updated financial ratios first. Brian tapped his fingers against the desk. We'll figure it out. David had heard that sentence before. Too many times. He left the office unconvinced. That evening, Brian stayed late reviewing spreadsheets long after most employees had gone home. He disliked admitting problems even to himself. The company remained profitable. Demand remained strong. Large customer payments were expected within weeks. The shortage, he believed, was merely timing. Nothing more. Across the city, Kimberly King finished reviewing another portfolio update with Olivia Brooks. Most investments required only routine discussion. Then Olivia opened the Carter Freight Solutions file. The next payment is approaching. Kimberly nodded. I know. The company requested no amendments. Correct. They're still reporting compliance. Kimberly studied the latest statements carefully. They're optimistic. Olivia looked at her. You don't sound convinced. I'm observing. What do you see? Kimberly highlighted several figures. Working capital has declined. Yes. Cash reserves are shrinking. Also yes. The business can survive this. Olivia waited. If management becomes more disciplined. Neither woman mentioned Brian by name. Professional conversations required objectivity, yet both understood exactly where the greatest uncertainty lay. 3 days later, Brian attended another transportation conference in Washington, D.C. Ashley accompanied him. The event lasted 2 days. Officially, Brian extended the trip through the weekend. He informed Kimberly by text. Unexpected client meetings. Home Sunday, Kimberly read the message once, then placed her phone back on the kitchen counter. She neither questioned nor challenged the explanation. Instead, she opened her calendar and wrote down the revised travel dates. Nothing more. On Saturday afternoon, Olivia called unexpectedly. I hate making this call. Kimberly recognized the tone immediately. What happened? I was in Georgetown meeting a client. Kimberly listened quietly. I saw Brian. And he wasn't with customers. A brief pause followed. He and Ashley were walking through the waterfront district. Kimberly closed her eyes for only a moment. Thank you. I'm sorry. So am I. After ending the call, Kimberly remained seated at the dining table for nearly 10 minutes. Not crying, not angry, simply still. Finally, she walked into her office and unlocked the cabinet containing years of carefully organized notebooks. She opened a new page. Date, location, independent witness. No conclusions, only facts. When Brian returned Sunday evening, he appeared unusually relaxed. The meetings went well. I'm glad. We may have another national contract. That would help. Brian smiled. It will. Kimberly looked at him calmly. I hope so. He interpreted her response as support. She intended it as truth, because the company genuinely needed additional revenue. Monday morning brought another surprise. David Reynolds received an email from the company's primary bank. The subject line read, "Additional financial documentation required." He immediately forwarded it to Brian. Within minutes, they were seated together. "The bank wants updated liquidity statements." Brian skimmed the message. "They review us every quarter." "This review is different." "How?" "They're requesting supplemental information." Brian looked irritated. "We're making every payment." "So far." Brian leaned back. "They're nervous because we're growing." David answered carefully. "They're nervous because leverage has increased." Brian stood and walked toward the window. "I've built this company from nothing." "I know. I'm not letting a few cautious bankers slow us down." David said nothing. He understood pride. He also understood mathematics. The two rarely negotiated successfully. As payment day approached, cash became increasingly tight. Several large customers delayed invoices unexpectedly. Fuel prices rose again. Construction costs at the New Jersey facility exceeded revised estimates. David proposed delaying executive travel. Brian rejected the idea. He proposed reducing marketing expenditures. Ashley argued against it. "We're finally becoming recognizable nationally." Brian agreed. Visibility mattered, at least to him. The payment deadline arrived on a humid Thursday morning. David watched the Treasury account closely. Expected deposits had not arrived. The available balance remained below what was required. He entered Brian's office immediately. "We're short." Brian looked up sharply. "By how much?" David gave him the figure. Brian stared silently. "When are the customer payments expected?" "Tomorrow. We only need one day." David remained quiet. Brian picked up the phone. "I'll call." He spent nearly 4 hours contacting customers, requesting accelerated payments. Some promised cooperation. Others explained their own accounting schedules. None transferred money that day. At 4:42 p.m., David returned. "The payment window closes in 18 minutes. Brian rubbed his forehead. "We're close. Not close enough." Silence filled the office. For the first time since founding Carter Freight Solutions, Brian faced a possibility he had always believed happened to other companies. Missing a contractual obligation. Not because the business lacked value, because cash had arrived too late. At exactly 5:01 p.m., the payment remained incomplete. The system automatically recorded the missed deadline. Across Boston, inside Kimberly's lending office, an encrypted notification appeared. "Payment status not received." She opened the file carefully. No emotion crossed her face. Only concentration. According to the loan agreement, a short grace period now applied before formal default procedures would begin. The contract was clear. Every borrower received identical treatment. No exceptions. She immediately called Michael Bennett. "I just received the alert." "So did I." "What's next?" Michael opened the digital agreement. "We follow the contract. No more. No less." Kimberly nodded. "Please make sure everything is handled exactly according to procedure." "It always is." After ending the call, she remained seated in silence. Not because she wanted Brian punished, because she had hoped this day would never come. Upstairs in the Carter home, Brian had not yet arrived. He was still inside his office trying to convince himself that tomorrow's incoming payments would erase today's mistake. He believed the missed deadline was nothing more than an administrative inconvenience. He did not understand that in commercial lending, dates carried legal weight. Promises were measured by calendars, not intentions. Inside secure banking systems, timestamps had already been recorded. Electronic records had already been archived. The first missed payment now existed permanently, invisible to the public, unknown to most employees, but impossible to erase. And for Kimberly, who had spent an entire career watching small financial problems become irreversible disasters, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The first default rarely destroyed a company. What followed afterward often did. The missed payment remained invisible to the outside world. No newspaper reported it. No industry publication questioned Carter Freight Solutions. Clients continued placing orders. Employees arrived each morning, believing the company was simply navigating another busy season. Inside the secured databases of the lending fund, however, the status of the loan had changed. Current, late, grace period active. For Kimberly King, those 3 words carried more weight than any headline ever could. She had reviewed thousands of commercial loans throughout her career. Most companies did not collapse the day they missed a payment. Many recovered quickly. Some never missed another deadline. What determined the outcome was not the late payment itself. It was what management chose to do next. On Friday morning, Michael Bennett arrived at Kimberly's office carrying a folder marked "Confidential." He placed it on the conference table. The grace period officially began yesterday. Kimberly nodded. "I've reviewed the notification." Michael opened the file. "Our obligations are straightforward." He pointed to the relevant clause. The borrower must cure the missed payment before the grace period expires. And if they don't, we issue a formal notice of default. Kimberly looked carefully at the language. Every sentence reflected standard commercial lending practice. No hidden conditions, no unusual penalties, nothing vindictive. Simply the agreement every borrower accepted before receiving funding. She closed the folder. "Proceed exactly as written." Michael watched her for a moment. "Are you certain you don't want to contact Brian privately?" Kimberly answered without hesitation. "No. He doesn't know. I know. You could warn him." Kimberly folded her hands calmly. "If I intervene now, I stop being a lender." Michael understood. "And become only a wife." She nodded once. "I can't be both." It was perhaps the most painful sentence she had spoken in years. Across town, Brian arrived at the office determined to solve the cash shortage before anyone noticed. He called David Reynolds into his office before 8 o'clock. "Any deposits?" David checked his tablet. 2 smaller payments." "What about Harrison Manufacturing?" "Delayed until Monday." Brian exhaled slowly. "Summit Distribution." "They're waiting on internal approval." Brian stared at the ceiling. "We're running out of time." David remained composed. "We still have options." Brian looked at him. "Such as?" "Reduce discretionary spending immediately." Brian nodded. "Done. Postpone executive travel." A brief silence followed. "We'll discuss it." David continued. "Freeze non-essential hiring." "Fine. Delay marketing expenditures." Brian hesitated. "Ashley won't like that." David answered quietly. "The loan agreement doesn't mention Ashley." Brian said nothing. A few hours later, Ashley entered Brian's office, carrying mock-ups for a national advertising campaign. She spread glossy presentation boards across the desk. "This is exactly what we need before the fall conference season." Brian barely looked at them. "We may need to postpone." Ashley frowned. "Why?" "Cash flow. It's temporary." "I know." She sat down across from him. "If we stop promoting ourselves now, competitors gain momentum." Brian rubbed his forehead. "I'm aware." Ashley leaned forward. "Companies don't become industry leaders by acting scared." The sentence lingered in Brian's mind. It sounded remarkably similar to something he had once said himself. By the end of the meeting, he approved only half the campaign. It was the first time Ashley had seen him hesitate over spending. She didn't like it. Meanwhile, Kimberly followed her normal routine. Breakfast, garden, investment reviews, conference calls. From the outside, nothing about her life appeared different. Only the locked folder on her desk reflected the growing weight she carried. Later that afternoon, Olivia Brooks joined Kimberly for their scheduled portfolio meeting. After reviewing several investments, Olivia carefully opened the Carter Freight Solutions file. "No payment yet," Kimberly nodded. "I know. What are you hoping happens?" Kimberly looked toward the window. "I'm hoping Brian realizes the seriousness of this." "You think he will?" "I don't know." Olivia studied her friend. "You still love him?" Kimberly answered honestly. "Love and accountability aren't opposites." Olivia remained silent. Kimberly continued softly. "If the company recovers, everyone benefits. And if it doesn't," Kimberly closed the folder, "then the contract speaks for itself." Across the city, Brian's personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. Ashley had grown accustomed to expensive dinners, after conferences, luxury hotels, during business trips, and spontaneous weekend travel whenever schedules allowed. She viewed Brian not only as a successful executive, but as a man whose future appeared limitless. That future, she assumed, would continue expanding indefinitely. Friday evening, they met at an upscale restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor. Ashley noticed Brian seemed distracted. "You've checked your phone 5 times." Brian forced a smile. "Busy week. Financial, operational." She reached across the table. "You always solve problems." Brian appreciated her confidence. He also knew she understood almost nothing about the company's finances. He preferred keeping it that way. After dinner, Ashley suggested a weekend getaway. "We both need a break." Brian hesitated. "I've got work." "You always have work." She smiled playfully. "That's why you need the break." Against his better judgment, Brian agreed. The reservation was made before dessert arrived. The expense went onto the corporate credit card. Saturday morning, David Reynolds reviewed the latest accounting reports. Another unnecessary executive travel expense. He closed his eyes briefly. The company needed liquidity, not luxury. He considered calling Brian. Instead, he updated the internal cash forecast once again. The numbers looked worse. Monday morning brought no miracle. The expected customer payments arrived partially, not completely. Enough to reduce pressure, not enough to eliminate it. David entered Brian's office carrying revised figures. "We're still behind." Brian looked exhausted. "I know. We need outside help." "What kind?" "Short-term bridge financing." Brian shook his head immediately. "No." "Why?" "I just closed the biggest loan in company history." David answered carefully. "And now we're struggling to meet it." Brian stood abruptly. "I'm not asking another lender for money." David watched him quietly. "Pride doesn't improve liquidity." Brian looked away. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Brian said something David had never heard before. "I'll fix it." David believed he meant it. He simply wasn't sure Brian knew how. That afternoon, Michael Bennett finalized the formal documentation required if the grace period expired without payment. Every notice had already been drafted, every legal citation verified, every timeline confirmed. He called Kimberly. "I wanted you to know everything is ready." She closed her notebook. I expected that. We haven't sent anything. Not yet. The borrower still has time. Kimberly thanked him. After ending the call, she walked outside into her garden. The roses she had planted years earlier were blooming beautifully despite the intense summer heat. She knelt quietly beside one flower bed, removing small weeds that had appeared between the stems. It reminded her of something her father used to say: "Problems ignored while they're small eventually demand far more effort." She smiled sadly at the memory. Brian, meanwhile, sat alone in his office long after sunset. The building had emptied hours earlier. Only emergency lights illuminated the hallways. On his desk lay 2 stacks of paper. One contained unpaid invoices. The other contained Ashley's proposal for another nationwide branding campaign. He stared at both for a long time. One represented reality. The other represented image. For the first time in years, Brian wasn't certain which mattered more. His phone vibrated. A message from Ashley. "Dinner tomorrow. I miss you already." Another vibration followed almost immediately. An automated reminder from the finance department. Grace period. 3 business days remaining. Brian looked at both notifications side by side. He answered Ashley first. Then he silenced the financial reminder without opening it again. Across the city, Kimberly was closing another notebook. Every date, every payment, every legal deadline. Everything had been documented. She had spent years believing discipline protected people from avoidable pain. Now she was watching the man she once trusted most choose one decision at a time, which warnings deserved his attention. And she feared she already knew the answer. 3 business days disappeared faster than Brian Carter expected. Every morning began with the same determination. Every evening ended with the same unfinished calculations. The delayed customer payments arrived in smaller amounts than projected. Several clients requested additional time. One large contract remained tied up in a dispute over delivery schedules. Individually, none of the problems threatened Carter Freight Solutions. Together, they created something far more dangerous. They consumed time. Time was the one resource the loan agreement refused to extend without consequence. Monday morning began with another meeting between Brian and David Reynolds. The atmosphere inside the executive conference room felt noticeably different from previous weeks. No one spoke about expansion. No one discussed national branding. The presentation on the large monitor contained only numbers: cash, debt, obligations, deadlines. David adjusted his glasses before speaking. "The grace period expires today." Brian nodded. "I know. We still don't have sufficient available cash." What if Harrison Manufacturing wires payment this afternoon? They've already delayed twice. Brian folded his arms. "They promised." David answered carefully. "Contracts matter more than promises." The sentence landed heavily inside the room. Brian recognized the irony without acknowledging it. "What are our options?" David turned another page. "We can request a temporary waiver." "From the lender?" "Yes." Brian shook his head immediately. "No." David looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because it signals weakness. It signals communication." Brian stood and walked toward the window overlooking the parking lot. "I've spent years convincing lenders we're reliable." David remained seated. Reliable borrowers communicate before deadlines. Brian didn't answer. He simply continued staring outside. After several moments, David spoke again. "If we don't contact them voluntarily, they'll contact us." Brian finally turned around. "Let's wait until this afternoon." David already knew what waiting usually meant. Hope. Hope was not a financing strategy. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles away, Kimberly King sat inside the conference room of her investment office, reviewing compliance reports with Michael Bennett and Olivia Brooks. A digital clock on the wall displayed the exact time. 9:15 a.m. Michael closed one folder before opening another. If payment isn't received today, the file moves automatically into formal default processing. Kimberly nodded. I've reviewed the procedure. Olivia looked at her quietly. You haven't changed your mind? Kimberly understood the question. No. You still won't intervene personally? No. Michael spoke gently. This isn't easy. Kimberly looked down at the documents. It isn't supposed to be. Silence settled briefly around the conference table. No one questioned her again. Professional responsibility sometimes required painful consistency. The law did not ask who loved whom. It asked what had been agreed upon. At Carter Freight Solutions, Ashley Morgan entered Brian's office carrying 2 coffee cups. You look exhausted. Brian accepted the drink gratefully. Busy week. I've noticed. She sat across from him. You've canceled 2 dinners. I know. You've barely answered my messages. Brian managed a tired smile. Things are complicated. Ashley studied him. Business? Yes. Anything serious? Brian hesitated. No. It was the easiest lie he had told all week. Ashley relaxed immediately. I was beginning to think you were avoiding me. Brian reached across the desk and squeezed her hand. Never. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, long enough for someone passing the office to notice, long enough for the security camera mounted in the hallway to record it. Neither of them paid attention. Outside the office, David Reynolds walked toward the finance department carrying updated banking reports. He had seen nothing. He simply continued working. The morning passed slowly. Brian called customers, negotiated faster payments, requested accounting updates, reviewed pending invoices. Every answer sounded encouraging. None produced immediate cash. At exactly 2:30 p.m., David entered his office once more. Harrison Manufacturing. Brian looked up hopefully. They wired part of the balance. Enough. David shook his head. No. Brian leaned back heavily. How much are we short now? David gave him the figure. It was smaller, still significant. Brian rubbed both hands across his face. There has to be another way. David hesitated before speaking. There is. Brian looked at him. Request temporary accommodation. Brian laughed bitterly. You really won't let that go? David answered quietly. I don't want to see this become something bigger. Brian stood again. It won't. David gathered his papers. I hope you're right. When he left the office, Brian remained alone. His confidence had begun giving way to frustration. Not because the business lacked value, because reality refused to follow his timetable. Across Boston, Michael Bennett received an automated notification from the fund's banking platform. No payment. He looked toward Kimberly. The deadline is approaching. She simply nodded. Her expression remained calm. Inside, however, memories continued surfacing unexpectedly. Brian teaching neighborhood children how to ride bicycles. Brian staying awake all night beside her hospital bed after surgery years earlier. Brian celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary with handwritten letters instead of expensive gifts because money had been tight. Those memories still existed. They were real. So were the documents lying on the conference table. Love had never erased obligations. It simply made them harder to enforce. Late that afternoon, the Funds Compliance Department completed its final payment verification. No incoming transfer. The system updated automatically. Grace period expired. File status formal default review. Michael looked at Kimberly. This is the point where procedure changes. I know. We prepare the notice. Kimberly took a slow breath. Please proceed. Michael nodded once. No celebration, no satisfaction, only work. Inside the legal department, staff members generated the official notice of default. Every paragraph referenced specific sections of the loan agreement. Every calculation matched bank records. Every deadline reflected contractual language previously accepted by both parties. No accusations, no emotion, only facts. Back at Carter Freight Solutions, Brian's phone rang shortly after 5 o'clock. He recognized the number immediately. The lending administrator. For several seconds, he simply stared at the screen. Then he answered. This is Brian Carter. The representative spoke professionally. Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. I'm calling regarding your commercial lending account. Brian closed his office door. Yes. Our records indicate that the payment required under your agreement has not been received within the contractual grace period. Brian swallowed. I've been expecting incoming transfers. I understand. The funds are coming. I appreciate that. The representative's tone remained respectful. However, under the agreement, the account has now entered formal default review. Brian closed his eyes briefly. What happens next? You'll receive written notification outlining available remedies and required timelines. Can I speak with someone authorized to make decisions? Our legal department will contact you. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. When it ended, Brian remained standing motionless. For the first time since founding Carter Freight Solutions, the word default no longer belonged to someone else's company. It belonged to his. That evening, he arrived home later than usual. Kimberly was setting the dinner table. You worked late. So did you. She looked at him carefully. You seem tired. Long day? I imagine. Brian sat down heavily. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, loudly, he asked, do you ever think successful people become overconfident? Kimberly placed a bowl of soup in front of him. Sometimes. How do they know when it's happening? She met his eyes. They usually don't. Brian gave a quiet laugh. That's comforting. Kimberly answered softly. Most warnings arrive before consequences. The question is whether we're willing to hear them. Brian looked down at his untouched dinner. If only she knew, he thought. Kimberly lowered herself into her chair across from him. If only you knew, she thought. Neither sentence was spoken aloud. After dinner, Brian went directly upstairs, claiming he had more work. Kimberly remained in the kitchen, washing dishes slowly. Her phone vibrated. A message from Michael Bennett. Notice of default completed. Awaiting scheduled delivery tomorrow morning. Kimberly read the message once before locking her phone. Outside, darkness settled quietly across the neighborhood. Inside one house, a husband struggled to save the company he believed defined his future. Across the same house, his wife prepared herself to become the silent lender whose signature would soon carry more weight than every promise he had failed to keep. The legal process had begun. And unlike hope, it followed a schedule that never missed its deadlines. The notice of default arrived at Carter Freight Solutions at exactly 8:42 the following morning. It did not come dramatically. There were no uniformed officers, no flashing lights, no public confrontation. A courier walked through the front entrance, signed the reception log, handed a sealed envelope to the executive assistant, and quietly left the building. Business continued as usual. Forklifts moved freight. Dispatchers coordinated deliveries. Drivers checked schedules. No one realized that inside one ordinary envelope rested a legal document capable of changing the future of the entire company. Brian received it less than 5 minutes later. His assistant knocked softly. This was marked urgent. Brian thanked her and waited until the door closed before opening the envelope. The first page carried the letterhead of the lending consortium's legal representative. Below it appeared 3 words he had hoped never to see. Formal notice of default. He read every page slowly. The language remained surprisingly respectful. No accusations, no insults, only dates. Payment history, contract clauses, bank records. The document outlined exactly how the payment deadline had passed, referenced the grace period already provided, and listed the contractual remedies now available to the lender. Brian reached the final page. If the borrower failed to cure the default within the specified legal time frame, additional enforcement actions could begin. He placed the papers on his desk and stared at them silently. For the first time in years, confidence failed to produce an immediate solution. A knock interrupted his thoughts. David Reynolds entered carrying another financial report. He noticed the documents immediately. It came. Brian nodded. This morning. David sat down without speaking. After nearly a minute, Brian finally asked, "Have you ever received one of these before?" David answered honestly, "Yes." Brian looked surprised. "At another company. What happened?" David chose his words carefully. They ignored the first notice, and they focused on public image instead of negotiations. Brian already understood where the story ended. They lost everything. David nodded. The default didn't destroy them. The delay did. Brian leaned back in his chair. "What would you do?" "I'd call the lender." Brian looked down again. "I don't even know who's making the decisions." David pointed toward the letter. "The attorneys do." "No." Brian shook his head slowly. "Somebody behind them." David had no answer. Across the city, Michael Bennett reviewed confirmation that the notice had been successfully delivered. Everything had proceeded according to schedule. Every requirement under the agreement had been satisfied. He called Kimberly. The notice was received. Kimberly closed the file she had been reviewing. "Any response?" "Not yet." "He'll respond." "I believe he will." Michael hesitated. "The next stage depends entirely on him." Kimberly thanked him quietly before ending the call. She remained seated for several moments. The office around her continued operating normally. Analysts reviewed applications. Compliance officers verified documentation. Phones rang steadily. Nothing about the day suggested that one of the fund's most significant loans involved her own husband. Only 3 people knew the complete truth: Kimberly, Michael, Olivia Brooks. Everyone else saw only another commercial file moving through standard legal procedures. Later that afternoon, Olivia entered Kimberly's office carrying 2 folders. "I've finished reviewing the quarterly portfolio." Kimberly smiled faintly. "Anything unusual?" "Only 1 file." They both knew which one. Olivia placed Carter Freight Solutions on the table. "The business itself remains valuable." Kimberly nodded. "I agree. If management stabilizes, spending recovery is possible." "It is." Olivia looked carefully at her friend. "Do you hope they recover?" Kimberly answered immediately. "Yes." Even now, Kimberly looked toward the window. "I never wanted the company to fail." "You wanted Brian to succeed." "I still do." Olivia remained quiet. Kimberly continued softly. But success built on avoiding reality doesn't last. Meanwhile, Brian had already contacted 3 different law firms seeking advice. Every attorney asked essentially the same questions. Had the payment actually been missed? Yes. Did the agreement contain a valid grace period? Yes. Had the lender followed contractual procedure? Apparently, yes. One attorney summarized the situation bluntly. This isn't about finding a legal loophole. It's about resolving the default. Brian thanked him and ended the call. The answer frustrated him. He had hoped someone would identify an error, a technical defect, a procedural mistake. Instead, every document appeared carefully prepared, almost meticulously. Late that afternoon, Ashley Morgan entered his office without knocking. "I've been trying to reach you." "I've been busy." She noticed the stack of legal papers. "What's going on?" Brian closed the folder. "Nothing serious." Ashley folded her arms. "You've said that 3 times this week." "It's business. I work here." Brian remained silent. Ashley stepped closer. "Brian," he finally spoke, "we missed a loan payment." Her expression changed immediately. "For how long?" "A few days." "And now?" The lender issued a default notice. Ashley sat down slowly. "I thought the company was doing great." "So did everyone else." She looked toward the window. "Can you fix it?" "I think so." "You think?" Brian rubbed his forehead. "I need time." Ashley forced a reassuring smile. "You always figure things out." But her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. She had entered the relationship believing Brian's success was permanent. Default notices had never been part of the picture she imagined. That evening, the company's board of advisors requested an emergency meeting. Although Carter Freight Solutions remained privately controlled, several outside advisors had helped guide its expansion. The atmosphere inside the boardroom felt unusually restrained. No one raised their voice. No one assigned blame. Instead, they reviewed facts: cash flow, debt obligations, available assets, pending receivables. One advisor finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "Have you spoken directly with the lender?" Brian shook his head. "Not yet." "Why?" "I want to understand my position first." The advisor leaned forward. "They already understand theirs." Silence followed. Another advisor added, "Lenders generally prefer repayment over litigation." Brian nodded. "I know." "Then give them a reason to believe repayment is possible." After the meeting ended, David quietly approached Brian. "They're right." "I know." "So what's stopping you?" Brian looked exhausted. "I don't like negotiating from weakness." David answered gently, "You're already negotiating from weakness. The only remaining choice is whether you negotiate honestly." Those words remained with Brian long after David walked away. At home that evening, Kimberly prepared dinner exactly as she had countless times before. Brian arrived unusually late. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of the day. "You haven't eaten," Kimberly observed. "I lost track of time." She served him quietly. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Brian asked, "Do you believe people deserve second chances?" Kimberly considered the question carefully. "Yes." "What if they made mistakes because they believed everything would work out?" She met his eyes. "Intentions matter. So do consequences." Brian nodded slowly. "I suppose that's fair." He almost continued, almost confessed, almost told her everything. Instead, he picked up his spoon. Kimberly watched him silently. Years earlier, he would have shared every business concern with her before anyone else. Now he carried his struggles alone. Convinced protecting his pride mattered more than seeking honest counsel. She could see the distance between who he had been and who he had become. It saddened her far more than the default notice itself. After Brian went upstairs, Kimberly entered her office. Michael had forwarded copies of the delivery confirmation courier receipt and compliance log. She reviewed each document carefully before placing them into the secure file. Everything had been preserved. Every communication, every timestamp, every acknowledgement. Professional procedure left little room for memory to disagree with facts. Before shutting down her computer, Kimberly opened her notebook and wrote one final sentence. People rarely lose everything in a single day. They lose it, one ignored warning at a time. She closed the notebook and locked the drawer. The next stage of the legal process would soon begin. Whether it ended in recovery or ruin no longer depended on contracts alone. It depended on whether Brian was finally willing to face the truth he had spent months postponing. Brian Carter had always believed that confidence could buy him time. For years it had. When suppliers questioned delayed deliveries, he persuaded them to wait. When investors hesitated, he convinced them to look at long-term growth. When employees worried about aggressive expansion, he inspired them with larger visions. Words had solved countless problems. Legal deadlines were different. They listened only to documents. 3 days after receiving the notice of default, Brian finally instructed David Reynolds to arrange a conference call with the lender's legal representatives. Not because he wanted to, because every attorney he had consulted had offered the same advice. Communicate, negotiate, document everything. At precisely 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, Brian David and the company's outside counsel joined the scheduled video conference. On the opposite side of the call sat Michael Bennett, accompanied by 2 compliance officers from the lending fund. Michael greeted everyone politely. "Good morning." Brian returned the greeting. His expression remained professional, though the exhaustion beneath his eyes had become impossible to hide. Michael opened the meeting without unnecessary introductions. "We're here to discuss the current status of the commercial lending agreement." Brian nodded. "I appreciate your time." Michael continued. "Our objective remains the same as it was when the loan originated." Brian looked slightly surprised. "Repayment?" "Exactly." The simplicity of the answer caught him off guard. For several days he had imagined an aggressive legal battle. Instead, the conversation sounded almost practical. David opened several financial reports. "We've experienced temporary liquidity constraints." Michael listened carefully. "We've reviewed the quarterly statements. Our receivables are improving." "I understand." "We expect substantial payments within the next 30 days. Michael made several notes. Then he asked a question Brian had not anticipated. "What measures have been taken to reduce discretionary expenditures?" Brian hesitated. "We've postponed several projects." "Which projects?" David answered before Brian could. "Future hiring." Michael nodded. "What about executive travel?" Silence. "What about marketing expenditures?" Another silence. Michael did not press further. He simply wrote another note. Professional conversations often revealed more through hesitation than through explanation. After nearly 40 minutes, Michael summarized the meeting. "The lending fund is willing to review any formal restructuring proposal supported by verifiable financial documentation." Brian leaned forward. "So negotiation is possible?" "It has always been possible." The answer lingered inside the room. Because it was true. Nothing in the contract prevented communication. Only delay had. The meeting ended respectfully. No voices were raised. No threats were made. Yet when Brian closed his laptop, he felt strangely defeated. The lender had never behaved like an enemy, which meant he could no longer blame them for his situation. Across Boston, Kimberly listened as Michael summarized the meeting later that afternoon. He finally reached out. I expected he would. He requested flexibility. Kimberly looked toward the garden outside her office window. Did he provide documentation? Some. Enough. Not yet. Michael placed another folder on the conference table. I believe he still thinks this is a short-term inconvenience. Kimberly answered quietly. Because he hasn't accepted how long the pattern has existed. Michael looked at her. The spending. The decisions. She folded her hands. Financial problems rarely begin when cash disappears. They begin when discipline does. Michael had heard her say similar words years earlier. They had never been wrong. Later that day, Olivia Brooks arrived carrying updated industry reports. Several transportation companies had begun slowing expansion because freight demand across parts of the Northeast showed signs of softening. Fuel prices continued climbing. Insurance premiums had increased again. Labor shortages remained unresolved. Olivia placed the reports beside Carter Freight Solutions' financial statements. The market is becoming less forgiving. Kimberly nodded. I've been expecting that. If Brian keeps expanding, he'll need stronger reserves instead of stronger appearances. Kimberly offered a faint smile. You notice that too. Meanwhile, Ashley Morgan had begun noticing changes of her own. Brian canceled another weekend trip. He postponed a luxury client dinner. He rejected a proposal for an expensive advertising campaign she had spent weeks developing. Ashley entered his office carrying the revised budget. You crossed out half the campaign. Brian looked up from another spreadsheet. We're cutting expenses. For how long? Until things stabilize. Ashley frowned. This isn't like you. Brian sighed. A lot of things aren't like me lately. She closed the office door. Tell me what's really happening. Brian remained silent. Ashley waited. Finally, well, he spoke. The company defaulted on one of its loans. The room became completely still. Ashley blinked twice. Defaulted? We missed a payment. I thought it was just delayed. It was. And now, we're negotiating. Ashley lowered herself into the chair opposite him. For several moments, neither spoke. She had imagined temporary cash flow problems, not legal default, not restructuring, not attorneys. Are we going under? She asked softly. Brian answered immediately. No. But his confidence sounded different now. Less certain, less convincing, Ashley noticed. That evening, after everyone else had left headquarters, David Reynolds remained in the finance department, organizing documents requested by the lender. Bank statements, accounts receivable aging reports, cash flow projections, vendor obligations, executive expense summaries. He paused while reviewing one section, corporate travel expenses. He compared conference schedules against reimbursement requests. Several entries appeared unusually expensive. Luxury hotels, extended stays, weekend reservations attached to business travel. Everything had been properly submitted. Everything had received authorization. Still, he quietly copied the records into the restructuring file. If the lender requested complete transparency, the company needed complete transparency. Facts could not be edited selectively. At home, Brian barely touched dinner. Kimberly noticed immediately. Long day, he nodded. Negotiations. Progress. A little. She waited. Brian surprised himself by continuing. They asked about spending. Kimberly remained calm. That seems reasonable. They questioned executive travel. She said nothing. They questioned marketing. Again, silence. Brian finally looked at her. If you were the lender... He stopped. Kimberly looked up. Yes. What would you care about most? She answered without hesitation. Whether the borrower understands why the default happened. Brian frowned. You mean the missed payment? No. She shook her head gently. The decisions that made the missed payment possible. Brian stared at her. The answer unsettled him, because somewhere deep inside, he knew she was right. After dinner, he walked into the backyard, alone. The evening air had cooled considerably. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to replay the previous year honestly. The expensive branding campaigns, the executive retreats, the luxury vehicle, the endless conferences, the confidence, Ashley, expansion, recognition. Some decisions still seemed justified. Others suddenly looked very different. Inside the house, Kimberly stood quietly at the kitchen window, watching him from a distance. She did not know exactly what he was thinking, but she recognized something she had not seen in a very long time. Reflection. Not panic, not denial. Reflection. It was a beginning. Whether it had arrived soon enough remained uncertain. Before going to bed, Kimberly opened her notebook once again. She added only one sentence beneath the previous entry. Acceptance is often the first payment a person makes toward correcting a mistake. She closed the notebook carefully. Across town, inside secure legal servers, additional emails, bank records, and compliance reports continued accumulating. Each document strengthened the factual history of the loan. Each timestamp quietly recorded another step in a process neither emotion nor regret could alter. Very soon, those records would no longer remain inside conference rooms and legal files. They would enter a public setting where investors, executives, and witnesses would finally learn the identity of the silent lender Brian had spent months trying to negotiate with. He still believed he was speaking to a financial institution. He had no idea he was slowly walking toward a room where the truth already knew his name. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning. It bore the letterhead of the Northeast Commercial Finance Association, announcing its annual Investment and Transportation Leadership Forum in Manhattan. For years, the event had been one of the industry's most respected gatherings. Commercial lenders, private equity firms, regional bank executives, corporate attorneys, transportation CEOs, institutional investors. They would all be there. Brian Carter had accepted the invitation months earlier, long before the default notice had arrived. Now he stared at the email on his screen with growing uncertainty. Under normal circumstances, appearing before hundreds of industry professionals would have been an opportunity. Now it felt like a test. Ashley Morgan stepped into his office carrying the printed agenda. The keynote panel is still on. Brian nodded absent-mindedly. I know. You don't sound excited? I've had other things on my mind. Ashley sat across from him. We should still go. Brian looked up. Why? Because disappearing now would create rumors. She wasn't wrong. Absence often invited more questions than presence. Brian finally nodded. We'll attend. Across Boston, Kimberly King received the same invitation. Her name appeared under a different category. Private investment partner. No mention of the lending fund. No reference to ownership. Only a discreet acknowledgement of her role as a private institutional investor. Michael Bennett entered her office later that afternoon carrying several folders. The association confirmed our meeting room. Kimberly looked at him. They approved the documentation. Michael nodded. Everything. What about confidentiality? It remains protected. Until, Michael answered carefully, until disclosure becomes legally necessary. Kimberly understood. The legal process had reached a point where transparency might soon outweigh confidentiality. Not because anyone wanted public attention, because commercial law required accuracy. Olivia Brooks joined them moments later. She placed updated financial reports on the conference table. Carter Freight Solutions submitted revised projections. Kimberly reviewed them quietly. They've reduced discretionary spending. Yes. Travel. Some. Marketing. A little. Kimberly continued reading. It should have happened months ago. Olivia nodded. It probably would have made a difference. Neither woman sounded judgmental, only factual. Meanwhile, David Reynolds spent nearly every day preparing documents requested during restructuring discussions. Bank statements, vendor obligations, payroll records, operating forecasts. Everything had to match exactly. One inconsistency could destroy credibility. Late Friday afternoon, he entered Brian's office. I've completed the expense reconciliation. Brian looked exhausted. Anything unusual? David hesitated. There are several executive travel expenses the lender may question. Brian already knew which ones. They were business-related. Mostly. Brian remained silent. David continued carefully. The timing overlaps with personal extensions. Brian closed his eyes briefly. I'll explain them. David looked at the stack of reports. They'll probably ask for supporting documentation. Brian nodded. I'll provide it. Neither man mentioned Ashley by name. They didn't have to. The following week, Brian and Ashley traveled to Manhattan. The city buzzed with its usual relentless energy. Luxury hotels overflowed with conference attendees. Restaurants hosted networking dinners. Financial executives greeted one another in crowded lobbies. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Yet Brian noticed something he had never paid attention to before. Conversations seemed quieter whenever legal issues entered the discussion. Successful executives spoke confidently about growth. Experienced lenders asked about cash flow. Seasoned attorneys asked about documentation. Perspective depended on profession. The evening before the conference officially began, Brian attended a private reception hosted by several transportation investors. Many congratulated him on his company's rapid expansion. He smiled politely, thanked them, accepted compliments. Inside, however, every conversation felt heavier than before. One investor approached him with a friendly smile. I heard you're working through some financing adjustments. Brian kept his expression neutral. Temporary. I'm sure. The investor nodded. Happens more often than people think. Brian appreciated the kindness. Still, he couldn't ignore the realization. News traveled quickly inside financial circles. The next morning, the conference ballroom filled early. Hundreds of attendees took their seats beneath elegant chandeliers. Large screens displayed industry statistics, while moderators introduced the day's panels. Brian sat beside Ashley several rows from the front. Across the ballroom, Kimberly entered quietly with Michael Bennett and Olivia Brooks. She wore a simple navy business suit. No dramatic entrance, no attempt to draw attention. Most attendees didn't recognize her. Those who did knew her only as a disciplined private investor. Brian never noticed her arrival. His attention remained fixed on the stage. After the opening keynote conference, organizers announced a special afternoon session addressing responsible commercial lending restructuring and borrower accountability. Attendance was voluntary. Nearly every executive stayed. The subject had become increasingly relevant across the industry. Michael leaned slightly toward Kimberly. This is where the discussion changes. She nodded once. During the panel, experienced commercial attorneys discussed common causes of business defaults: aggressive expansion, weak liquidity management, delayed communication, excessive executive spending. Each topic sounded uncomfortably familiar to Brian. Ashley noticed him shifting uneasily. "You okay?" "Just tired." But exhaustion wasn't the reason. Recognition was. One attorney on the panel concluded with a sentence that settled over the ballroom: "The documents rarely surprise us. The borrowers usually do." Scattered applause followed. Brian lowered his eyes. Later that afternoon, conference attendees dispersed into smaller breakout sessions. Brian headed toward one of the networking lounges, hoping informal conversations would distract him. Instead, David Reynolds approached. "I just received another email from the lender." Brian stopped walking. "What now?" "They've requested an in-person meeting." "When?" David looked at his phone. "This afternoon." "Here?" "Yes." Brian frowned. "They're attending the conference." "It appears so." Ashley looked between them. "I'll leave you two alone." She walked away before Brian could answer. David spoke quietly. "They want to review the restructuring proposal." Brian nodded. "Fine." "They also requested original bank records." "I brought them. And executive expense reports." Brian hesitated almost imperceptibly. "I have those too." David watched him carefully. "Complete copies." Brian looked away. "Yes." Whether the answer referred to certainty or hope, even Brian wasn't sure. Across another section of the conference center, Michael Bennett reviewed the schedule with Kimberly. "The meeting room is ready." She closed the folder in front of her. "Has everyone confirmed?" "Yes." "The bank representatives, they've arrived." "The restructuring analysts?" "Already inside." Michael paused. "Brian should be here within 30 minutes. Kimberly stood slowly. For the first time that day, Olivia noticed the slightest change in her expression. Not anger, not satisfaction, only sadness. "You don't have to attend," Olivia said gently. Kimberly shook her head. "I do." "As a lender?" "As someone responsible for the decisions already made." They walked together through the quiet hallway, leading toward the private conference rooms. Inside one room sat representatives from several financial institutions: commercial attorneys, compliance officers, independent restructuring specialists. Every document had been organized in advance. Bank statements rested beside payment histories. Email correspondence sat alongside signed loan agreements. Original records, verified copies, chronological timelines. Nothing had been prepared for drama. Everything had been prepared for accuracy. Brian and David stopped outside the conference room moments later. Brian adjusted his tie. He took one slow breath. "I'm ready." David looked at him. "Just answer honestly." Brian nodded. Then he opened the door. He still believed he was walking into another negotiation. He had no idea that among the people waiting inside was the one person who knew every promise he had ever signed, every payment he had missed, and every decision that had brought him there. The woman sitting quietly near the end of the polished conference table kept her eyes on the file in front of her. She did not look up as Brian entered. Not yet. The documents would speak first. They always had. Brian Carter entered the conference room expecting another difficult negotiation. Instead, he stepped into the most honest room he had occupied in years. A polished walnut table stretched through the center of the room. At one end sat representatives from the participating financial institutions. Beside them were restructuring specialists, compliance officers, and outside counsel. Every seat already contained neatly organized binders, legal pads, and printed financial summaries. No one appeared emotional. No one appeared eager for confrontation. Everything about the room reflected procedure. David Reynolds followed Brian inside and quietly closed the door. Michael Bennett stood. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." Brian extended his hand. "Good afternoon." Michael shook it politely. "Please have a seat." Brian settled into the chair opposite the legal team. Only then did he notice a familiar profile near the far end of the table. Kimberly. She wore a navy suit, her hair neatly tied back, a leather portfolio resting calmly before her. She did not look nervous. She did not look angry. She simply reviewed several pages while waiting for the meeting to begin. Brian stared for a brief moment. "What are you doing here?" Kimberly finally lifted her eyes. "Our invitation came through the same conference." Brian frowned. "I didn't know you attended finance events." Michael spoke before Kimberly answered. "Mrs. King has been involved in commercial lending for quite some time." Brian looked confused. "I thought she managed investments." Kimberly answered quietly. "I do." Nothing more. Michael resumed the meeting. "The purpose of today's session is to review the current restructuring proposal, verify supporting documentation, and determine whether a mutually acceptable resolution remains possible." Everyone nodded. Michael turned toward David. "Mr. Reynolds, thank you for providing the updated financial statements." David slid several folders across the table. "They're complete through last Friday." Michael reviewed them carefully. "So noted." The discussion began professionally. Cash flow projections, pending receivables, operating expenses, collateral valuations, warehouse utilization. Nothing dramatic occurred. For nearly 40 minutes, the conversation remained entirely focused on numbers. Brian gradually relaxed. Perhaps this meeting really could produce a solution. Perhaps the lender would approve additional time. One restructuring analyst adjusted his glasses. "I'd like clarification regarding executive expenditures over the previous 12 months. David handed over another report. "We've already reduced discretionary spending." The analyst nodded. "We noticed." He turned another page. "Our concern involves the period before reductions." Brian answered confidently. "Those expenditures supported national expansion." "Some certainly did." The analyst highlighted several entries. Others appear unrelated to core operations. Luxury hotels, weekend travel extensions, entertainment expenses, premium vehicle leases. Brian cleared his throat. "Client relationship development." Michael looked toward him. "Do supporting documentation and attendee records exist for each expense?" Brian hesitated. "Most of them." The room became noticeably quieter. Michael did not challenge him. Instead, he marked several items for later review. Another compliance officer spoke. "We've also compared executive travel reimbursement with conference attendance records." Brian felt his pulse quicken. Several folders were opened simultaneously. Conference registration logs, hotel invoices, corporate card statements, airline itineraries. Every document carried dates, every date aligned. The officer looked toward Brian. "We noted multiple personal extensions attached to business travel." Brian answered carefully. "I remained available for client meetings." "Were meetings documented?" "Some were, some weren't." Again, Michael simply made another note. Nobody accused Brian of fraud. Nobody raised their voice. The facts themselves generated enough pressure. David remained completely still. For the first time, he realized how extensively the lender had documented every aspect of the loan relationship. Nothing appeared improvised. Everything had been verified. Michael closed one binder before opening another. I'd now like to discuss the loan's underwriting history. Brian nodded. I've always wondered how he secured financing that quickly. Michael looked briefly toward Kimberly, then back to Brian. The underwriting committee viewed Carter Freight Solutions as a fundamentally sound business. Brian allowed himself a small smile. I believe that. They also believed management possessed strong operational ability. Brian nodded again. But Michael folded his hands. They expressed concerns regarding expansion speed. Brian looked surprised. No one mentioned that. They did. Michael tapped the original underwriting memorandum. It was included among the internal risk assessments. Brian stared at the document. I never saw this. Borrowers rarely see internal committee discussions. Brian slowly leaned back. So someone defended the loan. Michael remained silent for several seconds. Yes. Who? No one answered immediately. Instead, Michael opened a sealed folder resting beside him. Inside lay the original committee recommendation, confidential memoranda, internal legal approvals, credit analyses. Each page carried signatures. Michael carefully removed the first document. Commercial lending decisions require multiple levels of review. Brian nodded impatiently. I understand. One reviewer argued strongly that your company deserved an opportunity despite identified risks. Brian looked around the table. I'd like to thank that person. Michael gently slid the document across the polished table. Perhaps you should. Brian picked it up. His eyes moved quickly across the page. Independent credit analysis. Lead reviewer, Kimberly King. For several seconds, he simply stared. He looked again. The signature remained exactly where it had been. Kimberly King, his wife. Brian looked up slowly. This, his voice failed. This can't be right. Michael calmly opened another binder. It is. Brian turned toward Kimberly. You reviewed my loan. She nodded once. Yes. You... He struggled to form complete sentences. You worked on this. I did. Why didn't you tell me? Kimberly answered with the same quiet voice she had maintained throughout the meeting. Because the process required confidentiality. Brian shook his head. No. There has to be some mistake. Michael spoke again. There isn't. He placed another document before Brian. Authorization of funding recommendation. Approved, Kimberly King. Brian's breathing became noticeably slower. His mind raced backward through the previous year. The careful questions Kimberly had asked, the conversations about cash reserves, the warnings about obligations, the repeated reminders that contracts mattered. She had known, all along. Another document appeared. Original Risk Memorandum, prepared by Kimberly. Brian began reading. The report praised the company's operational strengths, its loyal workforce, its growth potential, its regional reputation. Then came the concerns. Aggressive expansion, increasing leverage, need for disciplined liquidity management, quarterly monitoring recommended. Brian lowered the paper. Everything happened exactly the way you predicted. Kimberly remained silent. Michael answered instead. The recommendations were based on financial analysis. Brian looked back at Kimberly. You believed in my company? Yes. You approved the loan? Yes. You tried to protect it? Another quiet nod. Brian's shoulders slowly collapsed. Not from legal pressure, from understanding. Every opportunity he had celebrated as personal triumph had been quietly supported by the woman he had gradually pushed out of his life. He remembered dismissing her opinions, joking that she had too much free time, introducing Ashley while Kimberly stood only a few feet away, ignoring every warning she had offered without ever revealing why she knew so much. The room remained completely silent. No one interrupted, no one hurried him, because some truths required time to reach the person hearing them. Ashley Morgan appeared at the partially open conference room door, having come to ask whether the meeting had finished. She looked inside. Her eyes found Brian, then Kimberly, then the document spread across the table. Michael happened to glance toward the doorway. "Can we help you?" Ashley quietly shook her head. "No." She looked once more at Brian. Confusion filled her expression. Then she gently closed the door without another word. Inside the room, Brian never noticed her leaving. His attention remained fixed on Kimberly. "I thought," he stopped. "I thought I built all of this myself." Kimberly answered with remarkable gentleness. "You built a good company. You just stopped protecting it." Brian lowered his eyes. There was no accusation in her voice, no satisfaction, only truth. And somehow that truth weighed more heavily than anger ever could. Michael finally closed the last binder. "The remaining issue before this committee is whether restructuring remains feasible." No one spoke immediately, because every person in the room understood that the meeting had quietly transformed from a discussion about debt into something far deeper. Brian had finally discovered the identity of the silent lender. The documents had spoken, just as they always did. No one spoke for nearly half a minute after Michael Bennett closed the final binder. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt deserved. Brian Carter remained seated, his hands resting motionless on the polished conference table. The documents before him no longer looked like contracts or financial reports. They looked like a timeline. Every signature, every payment, every warning, every opportunity. Each page quietly documented a choice he had made. Not once had Kimberly King used her position to embarrass him. Not once had she interfered with the underwriting process to favor him unfairly. She had insisted on independent reviews, independent compliance, independent legal oversight. She had treated his company exactly as she treated every other borrower. Ironically, that had been the greatest act of respect she could have shown. Michael finally broke the silence. "The committee's responsibility is to determine whether restructuring serves the interests of both the lender and the borrower." He looked toward Brian. "Mr. Carter, before we continue, is there anything you would like the committee to know?" Brian stared at the documents for several more seconds before answering. "When I founded Carter Freight Solutions, I promised myself I would never blame other people for my failures." He paused. "I almost forgot that promise." No one interrupted. Brian continued. "I blamed the economy. I blamed timing. I blamed delayed payments." He looked briefly toward David Reynolds. "I even ignored people who tried to warn me." David lowered his eyes quietly. Brian turned toward Kimberly. "And the person who warned me most often," his voice weakened, "was sitting at my own dinner table." Kimberly listened without changing her expression. Not because she felt nothing. Because this meeting was not about emotion. It was about responsibility. Michael nodded once. "Thank you." He turned toward the restructuring specialists. After nearly 20 minutes of discussion reviewing revised financial projections, collateral values, and repayment schedules, the committee reached its conclusion. The business itself remained viable. Its customer base remained strong. Its operational infrastructure retained substantial value. The greatest weakness had never been the company. It had been leadership decisions. Michael looked toward Brian. The committee is prepared to approve a structured workout agreement. Brian looked up immediately. You are? Yes. The room remained quiet as Michael continued. The approval is subject to specific conditions. He read them one by one. Executive spending would be significantly restricted. Quarterly financial reporting would become monthly. Certain discretionary assets would be liquidated to strengthen cash reserves. Independent financial oversight would remain in place throughout the restructuring period. Any future default would trigger immediate enforcement under the original agreement. Brian listened carefully. None of the conditions felt unreasonable. In fact, they resembled the discipline Kimberly had quietly encouraged all along. I accept, Michael nodded. We'll prepare the amended documents. The meeting officially adjourned. Representatives gathered their folders. Compliance officers collected signed acknowledgments. Attorneys exchanged business cards. Within minutes, the conference room gradually emptied. Only 4 people remained: Brian, Kimberly, Michael, David. David quietly placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. I'll wait outside. Brian nodded gratefully. Michael gathered his briefcase. I'll give you both some privacy. The door closed softly behind them. For the first time in months, husband and wife sat alone. Neither rushed to speak. Brian finally looked at Kimberly. I don't know where to begin. She answered honestly, You don't have to begin anywhere. I owe you an apology. Kimberly remained quiet. Brian took a slow breath. I convinced myself I was protecting my pride. I stopped listening. I stopped asking. I stopped seeing you. Every sentence came more slowly than the last. I thought success meant proving I didn't need anyone. Kimberly looked at him gently. Success isn't the same as independence. Brian nodded. I know that now. Another silence followed. Brian spoke again. I also know about Ashley. Kimberly didn't appear surprised. I assumed you did. You never confronted me. No. Why? Kimberly answered after a long pause. Because if I needed to argue someone into choosing our marriage, she stopped. Then the choice had already been made. Brian closed his eyes. The truth hurt precisely because it contained no bitterness. I ended it. Kimberly looked at him. When? This morning. She said nothing. I called before the meeting. Brian rubbed his hands together nervously. I told her I needed to face the consequences of my own decisions. Kimberly nodded once. I hope you meant it. I did. She believed he was sincere. Whether sincerity could repair everything was another matter entirely. Brian looked around the nearly empty conference room. Can we start over? Kimberly smiled sadly. No. Brian lowered his head. I understand. We can't return to who we were. She reached into her portfolio and removed another envelope. Brian recognized the law firm's letterhead immediately. He looked up slowly. What's that? Divorce papers. The words were spoken without anger, without satisfaction, simply as fact. Brian accepted the envelope with trembling hands. You already decided. I did. When? The night I realized I had become someone you no longer trusted enough to tell the truth. Brian couldn't argue. Because it was true. She had not ended the marriage because of one affair, or one missed payment, or one lie. She had ended it because too many small choices had slowly destroyed the partnership they once shared. I won't fight it, Brian said quietly. Kimberly nodded. I didn't think you would. He looked at the documents resting in his lap. I never thanked you. For what? For believing in my company. Kimberly smiled gently. I believed in you. She stood. For a very long time. Brian watched as she collected her portfolio. You really did save the company. Kimberly shook her head. No. I gave it a chance. What saves it now is what you do next. She walked toward the conference room door. Just before leaving, she turned back one final time. I hope Carter Freight Solutions succeeds. Brian looked surprised. Even after everything. It employs hundreds of families. She smiled faintly. They deserve stability. Then she left. Brian remained seated alone. Not because the room suddenly felt empty, because he finally understood what genuine loss looked like. Several months later, Carter Freight Solutions continued operating under the restructuring agreement. The company sold unnecessary executive assets, reduced overhead, strengthened cash reserves. Monthly reports showed gradual improvement. The business survived. Brian changed with it. He drove a modest vehicle again, traveled only when necessary, listened more during executive meetings than he spoke. David Reynolds noticed the difference immediately. Confidence remained. Arrogance did not. Ashley Morgan quietly accepted a position with another marketing firm in Chicago. Neither she nor Brian contacted each other again. There was no dramatic ending, only distance. Kimberly finalized the divorce without public attention. No interviews, no accusations, no attempts to damage Brian's reputation. Their financial separation proceeded exactly as carefully as every other legal matter she handled. Months later, she expanded her private lending fund, continuing to support businesses led by disciplined entrepreneurs, willing to accept responsibility alongside opportunity. Her reputation grew quietly, just as she preferred. People often asked Michael Bennett what made Kimberly such an exceptional lender. His answer never changed. She never lets emotion replace evidence. What he rarely added was the lesson he had learned watching her through the hardest chapter of her life. Strength was not measured by how loudly someone demanded justice. Sometimes it was measured by the patience to let the truth speak through contracts, bank records, honest choices, and time. Brian occasionally saw Kimberly's name in financial publications, recognizing responsible private investment leaders. He never called. He respected the distance she had chosen. Whenever he signed new financing agreements, however, he read every clause carefully. Every payment date, every reporting requirement, every obligation. Not because he feared lenders, because he finally understood that promises deserved more than confidence. They deserved discipline. And some of life's most valuable lessons arrived not with raised voices, but with quiet people who chose dignity over revenge and allowed the truth to speak for itself. In every life, there comes a moment when we discover that the smallest decisions often shape the largest outcomes. Brian believed success was built through ambition alone, until he learned that ambition without discipline slowly erodes the very foundation it stands upon. Kimberly never sought recognition for the opportunities she created or the sacrifices she quietly made. She chose patience over argument documentation, over accusation, and dignity over revenge. In the end, justice did not arrive through humiliation or anger. It arrived through honesty, accountability, and the quiet strength to walk away without losing herself. If this story stayed with you, perhaps it wasn't because of the business, the contracts, or the courtroom procedures. Perhaps it was because we've all known someone who spoke too little, gave too much, or waited too long to be seen for who they truly were. If you'd like, share where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Reading your comments reminds us how stories can connect people across different places and different lives. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about resilience, integrity, and justice, finding its own path, you're warmly invited to like this video and subscribe. There will always be another story waiting, and we'd be grateful to have you with us when it begins.